She's my wife." The words tasted like ash and stale tobacco. Gilbert didn't know the woman shivering behind him in a stolen, moth-eaten wool coat. He only knew she weighed well over 200 pounds, breathed like a busted bellows, and harbored a panicked desperation in her eyes that meant a hangman's rope was waiting back east. Marshal Cobb sat on his gelding, spitting black juice into the fresh snow, waiting for a crack in the lie. Gilbert just stared back, casually thumbing the cold iron hammer of his Winchester. Snow in the high bitterroots didn't fall. It hunted. It drove horizontally through the pines, biting exposed skin like ground glass. Gilbert smelled her before he saw her. Not a perfume scent. It was the sharp metallic tang of fresh blood and the sour musk of a body sweating through fear in sub-zero temperatures. He found her pitched forward in a snowbank near the frozen edge of Hatchet Creek. She wasn't a delicate prairie blossom. She was a massive woman, built broad and thick, currently buried under layers of men's clothing that didn't fit her frame. A heavy canvas coat was split at the shoulder seam, exposing a layer of cheap calico, frozen rigid to her flesh. One of her boots was missing. Her bare foot was a block of waxy white ice. Gilbert prodded her thigh with the butt of his rifle. She didn't move. He debated leaving her. He had a line of beaver traps to check before the creek froze solid, and dragging a corpse wasn't on his agenda. But a low, wet rattle escaped her throat. A breath. "Damn it," he muttered. The wind snatched the words from his mouth. He knelt, grabbing the collar of her coat to haul her up. The dead weight of her shocked his shoulders. He was a strong man, corded with muscle from decades of hauling elk quarters over deadfall, but he grunted aloud as he strained to lift her upper body. She had to weigh 230, maybe more. Her eyes fluttered open. They weren't a romantic color. They were the muddy brown of a stirred-up river, bloodshot and wide with an animal terror. She thrashed a sudden violent heave of her heavy hips that knocked Gilbert off balance. He landed hard in the snow on his backside. "Don't touch me." Her voice was a cracked rasp. She scrambled backward, dragging her frozen foot, her chest heaving. "Suit yourself," Gilbert said. He stood brushing the snow from his buckskins. "You've got about an hour before your blood stops moving entirely. Coyotes will eat your soft parts while you're still watching them do it." He turned his back and started walking toward the tree line where his cabin sat tucked against a granite ridge. He didn't look back. He took 10 paces. 15. 20. The crunch of snow behind him made his jaw tighten. He stopped and turned. She was crawling. The snow was too deep, her weight too much to support on her remaining boot, so she dragged herself on her hands and knees like a wounded bear, panting, weeping, silently, snot freezing to her upper lip. Gilbert walked back. He didn't offer his hand. He grabbed her left arm, slung it over his neck, and gripped her thick waist. "Stand up," he ordered. She screamed when she put weight on the bare foot. "Scream again and I'll drop you," he said. "Hop. Lean on me." The trek to the cabin took 2 hours. It should have taken 20 minutes. Every step was a negotiation with gravity and exhaustion. She smelled of wet wool and unwashed hair. He smelled of pine tar wood smoke and old grease. They didn't speak. By the time he kicked his cabin door open, Gilbert's lungs were burning, and the woman had passed out again, entirely dead weight against his side. He dumped her onto the narrow cot in the corner of the one-room cabin. The frame groaned under her. He didn't bother being gentle. He stripped off her frozen canvas coat, threw it by the hearth, and set about building a fire. He didn't look at her. He didn't want to know her face. She was a problem, a massive, breathing inconvenience that was going to eat his winter rations. When the fire caught, he filled a cast-iron kettle with snow and swung it over the flames. Only then did he turn back to the cot. She was awake, watching him. She had pulled a heavy, rusted hunting knife from her skirt pocket and was pointing it unsteadily at his chest. Her hand was shaking so badly the blade vibrated. "Put that pig sticker away before you cut your own thumb off," Gilbert said. He didn't raise his hands. He walked to the small table, picked up a tin cup, and chipped a piece of hardtack into it. "Where am I?" she demanded. "Alive," he said, turning back. "Which is more than you deserve, wandering the pass in November in a dress. Give me the knife." No. Gilbert closed the distance in 2 strides. He didn't grab her wrist. He simply clamped his large, calloused hand over the blade and wrenched it sideways. The metal bit lightly into his palm, but he ignored the sting. He tossed the knife clattering onto the floorboards. She shrank back against the logs, pulling her knees up to her chest, trying to make her large body as small as possible. It was a pathetic sight. "I'm going to soak a rag in warm water," Gilbert said, his voice flat, devoid of any soothing cadence. "I'm going to wrap your foot. If it turns black by tomorrow, I'll have to cut your toes off with a hacksaw. If you fight me, I'll tie you to the bed." "Understood." She stared at his bleeding palm, then slowly nodded. 3 days passed. The foot didn't turn black, but it swelled to the size of a melon mottled purple and yellow. Her name, she finally offered, was Hattie. She didn't offer a last name. Gilbert didn't ask. The cabin was 12 by 14 feet. It was built for one man who spent most of his time outdoors. With Hattie inside, the space shrank to the size of a coffin. She took up half the room, just sitting by the fire. When she moved, the floorboards complained. Gilbert found himself hyper-aware of her every breath, every rustle of her skirts, the heavy, wet sound of her chewing the dried venison he gave her. He hated it. He had moved to the high country specifically to escape the noise of other people. Now he had a squatter. On the 4th morning, the dog started barking. Gilbert was at the table running a whetstone over his skinning knife. He stopped. The scrape of the stone ceased. The silence in the cabin stretched out heavy and suffocating. Hattie went rigid by the fire. The iron poker she was using to stir the coals slipped from her grip and clattered against the stone hearth. Gilbert looked at her. Her face had drained of color, leaving her skin looking like dirty wax. Sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the draft in the room. "Who is it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Gilbert stood, sliding the knife into the sheath at his belt. "Law, probably, or claim jumpers. Dogs bark different for a bear." He grabbed his Winchester from the corner. "Don't let them in," Hattie pleaded. She tried to stand her bad foot, failing her, and she fell heavily back onto the wooden stool. "Please, they'll kill me, they'll hang me." "What did you do?" Gilbert asked, his hand on the heavy iron latch of the door. "I killed a man," she said. It wasn't a confession wrung out of guilt. It was a desperate, ugly fact thrown on the table. He cornered me in the boarding house kitchen. He locked the door. I hit him with a meat mallet. I kept hitting him." Gilbert stared at her. He looked at her thick, powerful arms. He believed her. "Hide under the cot," he said. "I won't fit," she whispered, tears finally spilling over her thick cheeks. She was right. The cot was 6 inches off the floor. "Then sit there and keep your mouth shut," Gilbert said. He pulled the door open and stepped out into the biting wind, pulling the door shut behind him. 3 men on horseback were in his clearing. Their horses were blowing hard flanks, caked in frozen sweat. The man in the lead wore a heavy buffalo coat and a silver star pinned to the thick felt of his hat. Marshal Amos Cobb. Gilbert knew him. Cobb was a hard man who enjoyed the authority of the badge a little too much. The 2 deputies behind him looked cold and miserable. "Morning, Gilbert," Cobb called out, reining in his gelding. He spat a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the snow. "Cobb," Gilbert replied, not stepping off the porch. He kept the Winchester angled down but gripped tightly. You're off your usual trail. Passes closed. Hunting a stray, Cobb said, leaning forward on his pommel. His eyes darted around the clearing, settling on the smoke curling from the chimney. A woman. Big girl. Hair the color of wet straw. Murdered a respectable businessman down in Helena. Stole a horse, but we found it dead at the bottom of the switchbacks. You seen anyone fit that bill? Ain't seen a soul in 3 weeks. Gilbert lied smoothly. Mind if we warm our bones by your fire? Cobb asked. It wasn't a request. One of the deputies was already shifting to dismount. I do mind, Gilbert said. His thumb clicked the hammer of the rifle back 1 notch. The metallic snick was loud in the crisp air. The deputy froze. Cobb's eyes narrowed. You hiding something in there, mountain man? Cobb asked, his voice losing its forced cordiality. You know the penalty for harboring a fugitive. Gilbert didn't know why he did it. Maybe he hated Cobb's arrogance. Maybe he remembered the animal terror in Hattie's eyes. Maybe he just didn't want the state's blood in his cabin. Ain't hiding a fugitive, Amos, Gilbert said, his voice flat and calm. He stepped slightly to the side, blocking the door with his body. Got my wife inside. She's sick with the ague. Ain't decent for 3 freezing lawmen to go tramping into her sick room. Cobb paused. He stared at Gilbert, chewing his tobacco slowly. Your wife, since when do you have a wife? Since I went down to Fort Benton in September, Gilbert said. Bought some traps. Found a woman willing to put up with the smell. Now, unless you've got a warrant with my name on it, get off my claim. Cobb chuckled a dry, humorless sound. A wife? Well, ain't that a picture? Still, I got a duty, Gilbert. I need to take a look inside. You cross that threshold, Amos, and I'll drop you where you stand, Gilbert said. He didn't yell. The quiet certainty in his voice made the threat heavier. Then I'll shoot your deputies. Then I'll bury you all in the tailings pile out back and sleep just fine tonight. The silence stretched. The wind howled through the pines, a lonely, desolate sound. Cobb weighed his options. He had 3 men, but Gilbert had the high ground cover and a reputation for not missing. For a woman who was probably already frozen dead in a snowbank somewhere, it wasn't worth a bullet in the gut. Fine, Cobb spat, pulling his horse's head around. But if I find out you're lying, Gilbert, I'll come back with a federal warrant and 20 men. And I'll burn this shack to the ground with you in it. Safe travels, Amos, Gilbert said. He watched them ride out, waiting until they were small black specks against the white expanse of the valley below, before he finally let the hammer down on the rifle. His hands were shaking. He gripped the door latch, suddenly furious with himself. He had just staked his life, his freedom, and his sanctuary on a lying, heavy-set murderer he barely knew. When Gilbert pushed the door open, the heat of the cabin hit him like a physical blow. The smell of rendered fat from the venison jerky he'd been making clung to the air. Hattie was standing by the table, her weight shifted off her bad foot, clutching the edge of the wood so hard her knuckles were white. They gone, she breathed. For now, Gilbert said. He walked past her, slamming the rifle back into the corner violently. The clatter made her flinch. He unbuttoned his coat, his movements jerky and angry. You understand what just happened. I just threatened a U.S. Marshal. I lied to the law. If they come back, I didn't ask you to do that. She interrupted, her voice, trembling but defensive. Gilbert whirled on her. You didn't have to. You being here is enough. You drag your fat carcass onto my property, smelling like death and carrying a murder charge, and suddenly I'm an accessory to a hanging offense. The words were cruel. He knew it the second they left his mouth. He watched the insult land. Hattie didn't cry. Instead, a hard, ugly mask dropped over her face. Her chin lifted. I ain't a carcass, she said, her voice dropping an octave, losing the frightened tremor. And I ain't asking for your charity. You point me toward the trail and I'll leave right now. You'd make it 50 yards before your foot gave out, and then you'd freeze, Gilbert snapped. I don't need your death on my conscience. You don't have a conscience, Hattie fired back. You live up here in the dirt because you hate people. You only saved me because leaving a body near your creek would ruin your water supply. Gilbert stared at her. She wasn't wrong. He walked to the fire, grabbed the iron tongs, and violently shoved a log deeper into the embers. Sparks showered up the chimney. You're my wife now. That's the story. If a trapper comes by, if a prospector gets lost, you are Hattie, whatever my last name is. What is your last name? She asked. Callahan, he muttered. Hattie Callahan. She tested the words. She sounded disgusted. I crushed a man's skull because he tried to force himself on me, Mr. Callahan. He told me I was too ugly to get a husband, so I should be grateful for his attention. I hit him until his face didn't look like a face anymore. I'm not a good woman. Don't expect me to act like a grateful little bride. I don't expect anything from you except quiet, Gilbert said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. A headache was building behind his eyes. You take the cot. I'll sleep on the floor near the fire. We have enough salted meat and flour to last until April if we half ration. In April the pass thaws. You leave. You go to Oregon, California, I don't care. But until then, you stay inside, and you stay out of my way. The rules were set. But surviving the winter in a 12-by-14 cabin required a delicate choreography that neither of them knew. The first 2 weeks were a miserable war of attrition. The silence in the cabin was thick enough to choke on. Gilbert spent as much time outside as the weather permitted, checking empty traps, chopping wood, until his hands blistered, doing anything to escape the heavy, oppressive presence of the woman inside. When he was indoors, they moved around each other like hostile dogs. The physical reality of Hattie's size made avoiding her impossible. If Gilbert was at the stove, Hattie couldn't get to the table. If Hattie was washing by the basin, Gilbert had to press himself against the wall to get to the door. Every brush of clothing, every accidental bump of a shoulder was met with a flinch and a glare. She hated his habits. He ate loudly, tearing at meat with his teeth. He spit in the fire. He didn't wash his clothes. He smelled like an animal. He hated her clumsiness. She knocked over his tin cups. She used too much wood for the fire because she was constantly cold. She breathed heavily in her sleep, a wet, rattling snore that kept him staring at the ceiling logs for hours. But worst of all was the intimacy forced upon them. Her foot required daily cleaning to stave off infection. The first time Gilbert told her to unwrap it, she refused. I can do it myself, she snapped, clutching her skirt down around her ankles. You can't see the heel properly, Gilbert said, holding a rag soaked in boiled willow bark water. Stop being a child. I've gutted 100 elk. Your foot isn't going to offend me. She hesitated, her face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. Slowly she lifted the hem of her skirt and pulled away the dirty bandaging. The flesh was swollen, the skin peeling away in thick, translucent strips. Gilbert knelt on the floorboards. He took her heel in his large, rough hand. He expected her skin to feel clammy and dead, but beneath the swelling it was startlingly warm. He dipped the rag and began to wipe the wound. Hattie hissed, her hands gripping the edge of the cot. "Hurts?" he asked, not looking up. "Yes," she ground out. "Good. Means the nerves aren't dead." He worked in silence for a few minutes. The smell of the willow bark filled the small space between them, bitter and earthy. "Why do you live up here?" she asked suddenly. Her voice was softer than it had been in weeks. Gilbert paused. He didn't want to have this conversation. He didn't want to trade secrets. He resumed wiping. "It's quiet." "It's lonely," she corrected. "Same thing," he muttered. He tied a fresh strip of clean cotton around her arch. "Keep your weight off it for another week." He stood up quickly, retreating to the other side of the room, putting the wooden table between them like a shield. He didn't want to notice that her eyes, when not wide with terror, were a startlingly clear shade of hazel. He didn't want to notice that, despite her bulk, her hands were surprisingly dexterous when she sewed. He just wanted it to be April. But outside, the snow was falling harder, burying the cabin deeper, sealing them inside the lie they had created. January arrived, not with a roar, but with a suffocating, soundless pressure. The snow piled up past the single cloudy window pane, plunging the cabin into a perpetual twilight. Time stopped meaning anything. There was only the stove, the wood pile, and the shrinking sacks of cornmeal and beans. Claustrophobia gnawed at Gilbert like a starved rat. He was a man who needed the horizon. Now his entire world was 14 feet across, stinking of stale breath, drying long johns, and the pervasive sour smell of boiling root vegetables. Hattie was going stir-crazy, too. Her foot had healed enough to bear weight, leaving her with a heavy rolling limp. She paced. She would walk from the hearth to the door 4 heavy steps. Turn. 4 steps back. The floorboards shrieked under her weight with every pass. Creak. Groan. Creak. Groan. "Sit down," Gilbert snapped one afternoon. He was trying to grease a trap spring at the table, his fingers slick with rendered bear fat. Hattie stopped, her broad shoulders rising as she took a sharp breath. "I need to move, Gilbert. My joints are locking up." "You're shaking dust down from the rafters," he muttered, not looking up. "And you're breathing like a winded draft horse." "Just sit." She didn't sit. She walked to the small counter where their tin plates were stacked. She picked up a rag and began to wipe a plate that had already been wiped twice that morning. Her hands, thick-fingered and clumsy, with pent-up energy, fumbled. The tin plate slipped, hit the edge of the wash basin, and clattered loudly against the floor. Gilbert slammed his fist on the table. The trap rattled. "Damn it, woman, are you completely useless?" The silence that followed was dense. Gilbert squeezed his eyes shut instantly, regretting the venom in his voice. It was the cabin fever talking the irritation of a man caged. When he opened his eyes, Hattie was staring at him. She didn't look frightened anymore. The terror of the freezing fugitive had been burned away by a month of shared squalor. Her muddy brown eyes were hard, fixed entirely on his face. She bent down her knees, popping loudly in the quiet room, and picked up the plate. She walked over to the table and dropped it right on top of his greased trap. "I am fat," she said, her voice a low, vibrating rumble in her chest. "I am clumsy. I killed a man who tried to rip my clothes off, and I dragged myself to your door because I wanted to live. But I am not useless, Gilbert, and I am not your dog to bark at." Gilbert stared at the grease smearing across the tin plate. He looked up at her. Her jaw was set a thick, stubborn line, trembling just slightly. "I cook your meals," she continued, stepping closer. She loomed over the table. "I stretch your rations so we don't starve by February. I boil your filthy shirts so you don't rot in your own sweat. You think you're the only one trapped in here. I have to look at you every day, smelling like a goat, chewing on your own misery because you don't know how to be a human being." He stood up. He was taller than her, but not by much, and she had 50 pounds on him. They stood chest to chest in the cramped space. He could smell the lye soap on her skin and the bitter tang of her anger. "You want out," Gilbert challenged, pointing a greasy finger toward the heavy oak door. "Start walking. The snow's only 4 feet deep. You can be useless out there." "Maybe I will," she spat. She turned and grabbed her mended canvas coat from the peg. She shoved her arms into it, her breathing ragged, tearing the door open. The wind howled into the room, instantly dropping the temperature, whipping snow across the floorboards. She stepped out into the blinding white, slamming the door behind her. Gilbert stood there. The draft licked at his ankles. 10 seconds passed. A minute. He picked up his rag and wiped the grease from the plate. He tried to focus on the trap spring. 5 minutes. Stupid! He hissed through his teeth. He threw the rag down, grabbed his heavy buffalo coat and wrenched the door open. The cold hit him like a shovel. He squinted against the driving snow. Hattie hadn't gone far. She was standing by the woodpile, 20 feet away, knee-deep in a drift. She wasn't walking. She was just standing there, her massive back to him, snow accumulating on her shoulders. Gilbert waded out to her. He didn't speak. He grabbed an armful of split pine logs, stacking them roughly in his arms. He nudged her with his elbow. "Grab some kindling," he yelled over the wind. She didn't move for a second. Then slowly she bent down and gathered a bundle of small twigs and splinters. They trudged back inside together. Gilbert kicked the door shut and dropped the logs by the hearth. Hattie dropped the kindling. They stood shivering, snow melting into puddles around their boots. "I ain't used to company," Gilbert said quietly, looking at the fire. It was the closest thing to an apology he possessed. Hattie unbuttoned her coat. Her hands were red and raw from the cold. "I ain't used to being looked at without disgust," she replied, her voice flat. Gilbert finally turned and looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the deep grooves of exhaustion around her mouth, the heavy defensive slump of her shoulders. She was a woman who had spent her entire life apologizing for taking up space. "I don't find you disgusting," he said. The words tasted foreign in his mouth. Hattie scoffed a bitter sound. She walked to her cot and sat down heavily. "Don't lie to me, Gilbert. It's worse than the yelling." Gilbert didn't argue. He just turned back to his traps. But the air in the cabin had shifted. The ice hadn't melted, but it had cracked. February brought a wet, bone-deep cold that ignored wool and leather. It seeped into the cabin logs and settled in the floorboards. Gilbert woke one morning with a feeling like crushed glass in his lungs. He tried to cough, but his chest seized a sharp stabbing pain ripping through his ribs. He rolled onto his side, shivering violently, despite being buried under 2 heavy buffalo robes. Hattie was already at the stove boiling coffee. The smell of the bitter grounds usually woke him up, but today it made his stomach heave. "Gilbert," she called out, noticing he hadn't moved to stoke the fire. He tried to answer, but all that came out was a wet, rattling gasp. She dropped the tin mug. It clattered against the stove. She crossed the room in 3 heavy strides and knelt beside his pallet on the floor. Her large hand pressed against his forehead. Her palm felt like a block of ice against his burning skin. "You're burning up," she said, panic edging into her voice. "Ma fine," he grunted, trying to push her hand away. His arm felt like it was made of lead. "You have the lung fever," she stated. She didn't ask. She knew the sound of that rattle. It was the sound that had taken her own father back in Ohio, years before the world had turned cruel to her. For the next 4 days, Gilbert drifted in and out of a violent delirium. The cabin became a hazy nightmare of shadows and agonizing heat. He dreamt of Amos Cobb riding through the door on a skeleton horse. He dreamt of drowning in Hatchet Creek, the ice sealing over his head. Through it all there was a constant, heavy presence. Hattie took over. The woman who had been afraid of her own shadow a month prior suddenly filled the cabin with a desperate, frantic energy. Gilbert's survival meant her survival, yes. But it became more than that. It became a war against the freezing dark. She chopped the wood. Gilbert would wake briefly, his eyes glassy, to see her massive frame silhouetted against the open door, swinging his heavy, splitting maul. She didn't have his technique, but she had pure brute force. The thwack of the iron wedge-splitting pine echoed through his fevered dreams. She hauled the wood in her breath, steaming her clothes soaked with sweat and melting snow. She melted ice for water. She boiled willow bark and forced the bitter tea down his throat, holding his head up with one strong arm, while he choked and coughed. On the third night the fever spiked. Gilbert began to thrash, kicking off the heavy robes, shivering so hard his teeth clicked together. Cold, he moaned, curling into a tight ball. So cold. The fire was roaring, the cast-iron stove glowing a dull, angry cherry red, but he was freezing from the inside out. Hattie stood over him, holding a wet rag. She looked around the cabin. There were no more blankets. His buckskins were soaked through with sour sweat. She made a decision. She didn't think about modesty or her own deep-seated shame about her body. She unbuttoned her heavy canvas coat and stripped off her outer wool sweater, leaving herself in a patched, sweat-stained cotton dress. She lay down on the floor pallet behind him. Gilbert groaned as a massive, heavy warmth pressed against his back. Hattie wrapped her thick, powerful arms around his shivering chest, pulling him tight against her broad chest and stomach. She pulled the buffalo robes over them both. She was a furnace. Her body heat, trapped beneath the heavy hides, began to seep into his frozen bones. "Quiet now," she whispered into his damp hair. Her voice was surprisingly gentle. "Just breathe, mountain man. I got you." Gilbert didn't fight it. In his delirium, he didn't know who she was. He only knew she was an anchor in a churning, freezing sea. He buried his face against her thick arm and finally slowly stopped shivering. When he woke, clear-headed, the fever had broken. He felt hollowed out, weak as a newborn calf, and incredibly thirsty. He opened his eyes. The cabin was dimly lit by the embers in the stove. He realized he was alone on the pallet. He turned his head slowly. Hattie was sitting in the chair by the table asleep. Her head was thrown back, her mouth slightly open, snoring softly. She looked exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin under her eyes, and her hands resting in her lap were covered in fresh blisters and pine pitch. Gilbert stared at her. The memory of the fever was fragmented, but he remembered the crushing, life-saving weight of her against him. He remembered the smell of lye soap and fear sweat. He tried to sit up, groaning as his stiff muscles protested. Hattie jerked awake, her hand instantly going to the table edge. She blinked her eyes, finding him in the gloom. "You're awake," she said, her voice rough. "Water," Gilbert croaked. She stood up, her bad knee popping, and brought him a tin cup. She knelt beside him, supporting his neck just as she had in his dreams, and tipped the water into his mouth. It tasted metallic and beautiful. "Thank you," he whispered, falling back against the rolled-up coat he used as a pillow. Hattie looked away, her cheeks coloring slightly. She stood up and walked back to the stove, busying herself with the coffee pot. "You were dying. I couldn't haul your body out to the creek by myself." It was a defensive lie. They both knew it. "Still," Gilbert said, watching her broad back. "Thank you." She didn't answer, but the rigid set of her shoulders softened just a fraction. April didn't arrive with green grass and bird song. It arrived with mud. The snowpack in the bitterroots began to melt from the bottom up. The eaves of the cabin dripped constantly, a maddening rhythmic plink, 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 into the puddles around the foundation. The world smelled of wet rot, decaying pine needles and raw, exposed earth. Gilbert was back on his feet, though he had lost 10 pounds he couldn't afford to lose. Hattie had lost weight too. Her clothes hung looser on her thick frame, but her arms and shoulders were harder muscled from 2 months of chopping wood and hauling water. The unspoken deadline hung over them like a guillotine. In April, the pass thaws. You leave. Neither of them mentioned it. They had fallen into a rhythm. It wasn't romance. It was a brutal, pragmatic partnership. Gilbert would hunt the lower elevations, bringing back stringy jackrabbits or the occasional grouse. Hattie would skin them, stretch the pelts, and cook the meat until it was tender enough to chew. They didn't bump into each other anymore. They knew the exact geometry of the cabin, moving around one another in a silent, practiced dance. One afternoon, Gilbert was on the porch, wiping mud from his Winchester. Hattie was inside, humming a low, tuneless hymn as she kneaded a small batch of dough. The sound of a horse sloshing through the muck down the trail made Gilbert freeze. He racked the lever of the rifle smoothly, chambering around. A lone rider broke through the tree line. It wasn't Amos Cobb. It was an older man, a trapper Gilbert knew vaguely from his trips to Fort Benton. A man named Silas, no Jeb. Jebediah. He was missing half an ear from a bar fight and smelled perpetually of beaver musk. "Gilbert," Jeb called out, raising a hand. His horse looked exhausted, belly deep in the slush. "God almighty, I thought this trail was going to swallow me whole." Gilbert lowered the rifle but kept it in his hand. "Jeb, you're early for the spring run." "Cabin fever near drove me to put a bullet in my own head," Jeb said, dismounting with a groan. He tied his horse to the porch rail. "Thought I'd push through. Mind if I sit by your stove for a spell? I got a jug of corn liquor I'm willing to share." Before Gilbert could answer, the cabin door swung open. Hattie stood in the doorway. She was wiping flour from her hands onto her stained apron. She stopped dead when she saw the stranger. The old terror flashed in her eyes for a split second before she clamped it down. Jeb stared at her. His jaw literally dropped. He looked from Hattie's massive frame to Gilbert, then back to Hattie. "Well, I'll be damned," Jeb breathed. "Rumor down at the trading post was true. Amos Cobb said you claimed you took a wife, Gilbert. I thought the bastard was pulling my leg. You really got yourself a woman up here." Gilbert's grip on the rifle tightened. He looked at Hattie. He saw the panic rising in her chest, the way her breath hitched. If Jeb realized who she was, if he had seen a wanted poster down in Helena, "She's my wife," Gilbert said. His voice was louder than it needed to be, firmer. Hattie looked at him, her hazel eyes wide. "Name's Hattie." Gilbert continued, stepping between Jeb and the door. "And she's busy baking. You can leave the jug, Jeb, but we aren't taking visitors today." Jeb looked taken aback. He scratched his beard, his eyes lingering disrespectfully on Hattie's broad chest and thick waist. "No offense meant Gilbert. Just surprised is all. She's a sturdy one. Built for the winter, ain't she?" He chuckled a wet, crude sound. A hot, sudden spike of rage flared in Gilbert's chest. It surprised him. He had spent his life ignoring the crude talk of other men, minding his own business. But the way Jeb was looking at Hattie like she was a prize hog at a county fair made his blood boil. Gilbert took a step down or off the porch. He shoved the barrel of the Winchester hard into Jeb's chest. Jeb choked, stumbling backward into the mud. "Get on your horse, Jeb," Gilbert said. His voice was a low, lethal whisper. "And if you ever speak about my wife again, I'll gut you and string your intestines through the pines." Jeb held his hands up his face, pale under the dirt. "Hey now, easy, Gilbert. Just making a joke. Lord, you've gone soft in the head." He scrambled back onto his horse, hauling roughly on the reins. "Crazy bastard," he muttered, spurring the animal back down the muddy trail. Gilbert stood in the muck, watching until Jeb was gone. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He turned around. Hattie was still standing in the doorway. She was clutching the doorframe, staring at him with an unreadable expression. Gilbert walked back up the steps. He knocked the mud off his boots against the post. "You didn't have to do that," Hattie said quietly. "He was just a fool. He was looking at you wrong." Gilbert muttered, walking past her into the cabin. He placed the rifle back in the corner. "Gilbert," Hattie said. She didn't turn around. She was looking out at the melting snow. "The pass is clearing. The trail is mostly mud now. It'll be passable by next week." Gilbert froze. His back was to her. He looked at the stove, at the dented tin plate he had yelled at her for dropping, at the heavy buffalo robes neatly folded on the cot. "I know," he said. "I should start packing my things," she said. Her voice trembled just a little. Gilbert turned around. He looked at this heavy, scarred, broken woman who had chopped his wood and held him while he burned with fever. He thought about the deafening silence that would return to the cabin when she left. "Your foot's still bad," Gilbert said roughly. "Mud's too deep. You'd break an ankle." Hattie turned to face him. A small, sad smile touched the corner of her lips. "I can walk, Gilbert. We made a deal. April." "Deals change," he snapped. He grabbed a piece of firewood and shoved it violently into the stove, closing the iron door with a clang. He didn't look at her. "You ain't leaving yet. I need help fixing the roof. Shingles the storm tore off. You're too heavy to go up there, but you can pass them up to me." Hattie stared at his back. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the awkward, defensive posture of a man who didn't know how to ask for what he wanted. She let out a long, slow breath. The tightness in her chest loosened. "All right, Mr. Callahan," Hattie said softly, picking up her dough from the table. "I'll stay. Just to pass the shingles." Outside, the ice continued to melt, dripping into the mud, washing away the winter. Spring didn't bring salvation. It brought a restless, itching heat. By May, the bitterroots shed their white armor, exposing a landscape of jagged grey rock and suffocating green pine. The air smelled intensely of damp earth and rotting needles. Inside the cabin, the heavy buffalo robes were shoved under the cot, replaced by thin, sweat-stained cotton sheets. Repairing the roof was a miserable chore. The winter storms had ripped a dozen cedar shakes from the southern eaves, letting the spring rain spit directly onto Gilbert's bedding. Gilbert straddled the roof's peak, the sun beating a relentless rhythm against the back of his neck. His shirt was off his skin, slick with sweat and dusted with sawdust. Below him, standing in a patch of crushed ferns, was Hattie. She held a stack of rough-hewn cedar shingles against her chest. Her face flushed a deep, mottled red from the exertion and the heat. "Another one." Gilbert grunted, extending a calloused hand down over the edge. Hattie reached up. Her thick bicep bulged under the faded fabric of her dress. She didn't just hand him the shingle. She pressed it firmly into his palm, ensuring he had a good grip before letting go. Her fingers, slick with sweat, brushed against his. The contact was brief, rough like sandpaper, but it made a muscle in Gilbert's jaw twitch. "That's 20, she called out, wiping a forearm across her dripping forehead. She was breathing heavily, the sound wet and laborious in the humid air. "You aiming to rebuild the whole structure, or just patch the holes?" "Holes," Gilbert muttered, shifting his weight. The dry shingles scraped against his denim trousers. "Pass me the nails." She handed up the heavy canvas pouch. As she stretched onto her tiptoes, her boot slipped in the slick mud near the foundation. She pitched forward with a startled gasp, dropping the pouch. It hit the dirt with a heavy metallic clank. Hattie caught herself against the rough log wall, her heavy frame hitting the timber with a dull thud. Gilbert dropped the shingle and scrambled to the edge, his chest tightening. "You all right?" Hattie pushed herself off the wall, staring down at her muddy hands. She didn't look up. "I'm fine. Just clumsy. Like always. I didn't ask if you were clumsy." Gilbert snapped the heat, and his own sudden spike of panic making his voice harsher than intended. "I asked if you were hurt." She finally looked up, squinting against the sun glaring off the roof. Her hazel eyes were defensive, narrowed into slits. I said, "I'm fine, Gilbert. Don't bark at me." She bent down, moving stiffly, and retrieved the spilled nails from the mud. She wiped them roughly on her apron before tossing the pouch up to him. He caught it, feeling the sharp sting of the iron through the canvas. They worked in silence for another hour. The tension between them, which had thawed slightly during the fever, had returned with the heat. It wasn't the hostile, terrified silence of November. It was something heavier. It was the suffocating awareness of two people trapped in a space that was suddenly too small, not because of the snow, but because of the proximity. Gilbert hammered the last nail home, the sharp crack, crack, crack echoing off the ridge. He slid down the pitch of the roof, his boots hitting the porch with a heavy thud. He wiped his face with a filthy rag, his chest heaving. Hattie was sitting on the chopping block near the woodpile, her face buried in her hands. Her broad shoulders were shaking. Gilbert froze. He had seen her terrified. He had seen her angry. He hadn't seen her cry since the day he dragged her out of the snow. He didn't know what to do with a weeping woman. His instinct was to walk into the timber and check a trap line that didn't exist. Instead, he walked over. His boots squelched in the mud. He stopped 3 feet from her, the smell of her sweat and lye soap hitting his nose. "Hattie," he said gruffly. She flinched, dropping her hands. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears. She looked exhausted, worn down to the nub. "I can't stay here, Gilbert." She choked out her voice, a raw rasp. "The mud is dry enough. I have to go." Gilbert's stomach dropped. It felt exactly like stepping off a blind ledge in the dark. "We had a deal. You're staying to help. The roof is fixed," she yelled, standing up suddenly. Her bulk forced him to take a half step back. "What else is there? Chopping wood for a winter. I won't be here for scraping plates." "You don't want me here. You tolerate me because you feel obligated, because you lied to the marshal, and now you're stuck." "I ain't stuck," Gilbert fired back, his own temper flaring to meet hers. "I told you to stay." "Why?" she demanded, tears spilling over her thick cheeks. "Give me one good reason, Gilbert. Look at me. I'm a fat, ugly, wanted murderer who takes up half your floor space and eats your winter stores. I am nothing but a burden. Why would you want me to stay?" The words hung in the humid air, brutal and ugly. Gilbert stared at her. He saw the deep, festering well of self-hatred she had carried her entire life. He saw the scars of every man who had ever sneered at her, including the one she had killed. He didn't have pretty words. He didn't know how to speak softly. "Because the cabin is too damn quiet when you go outside," he said. His voice was low, almost a growl. Hattie stopped crying. She stared at him, her chest heaving, the muddy hem of her dress plastered to her thick calves. "Because," Gilbert continued, taking a step forward, closing the distance between them. "When I had the fever, you didn't leave me to rot. Because you make the coffee too strong, and you snore louder than a grizzly, and for the first time in 10 years, I actually care if someone is sitting by the fire when I come in from the cold." He stopped, his chest nearly brushing hers. He looked down into her wide, shocked hazel eyes. "You aren't a burden, Hattie," he said softly, the harshness finally leaving his voice. "You're the only real thing in this God-forsaken valley." He didn't kiss her. It wasn't the time, and he wasn't that kind of man. But he reached out his calloused, dirty thumb, gently wiping a smear of mud from her cheekbone. She leaned into his touch just a fraction of an inch, letting out a breath that sounded like a sob. For the first time since she arrived, she didn't look like she was waiting for a blow. The illusion of peace lasted exactly 3 days. Gilbert was out back, turning over a patch of rocky soil with a heavy iron spade, trying to make a small root garden. The rhythmic chunk of metal biting into earth masked the sound of the approaching riders until they were already in the clearing. The dogs didn't bark. They just growled a low, ominous vibration in their throats. Gilbert dropped the spade. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked around the corner of the cabin. 3 horses stood by the porch. Amos Cobb was in the center, riding a massive roan gelding. His silver star caught the afternoon sun, a blinding pinprick of authority. Flanking him were 2 men Gilbert didn't recognize, hard-eyed drifters with repeater rifles resting casually across their saddle horns. Hattie was standing on the porch. She had an iron skillet in one hand, knuckles white, her face entirely drained of blood. She looked massive and trapped a cornered bear waiting for the bullet. Gilbert Cobb called out, spitting a stream of brown juice into the dust. "Looks like your wife's health has improved." Gilbert didn't walk to the porch. He walked deliberately to the chopping block, placing himself between the lawman and the cabin door. His Winchester was inside, resting by the stove. He was unarmed save for the hunting knife at his belt. Spring air does wonders, Amos. Gilbert said, his voice flat, showing none of the adrenaline flooding his veins. "What brings you up the mountain? You're a long way from a saloon." Cobb chuckled a dry, grating sound. He reached into his leather saddlebag and pulled out a folded piece of thick yellow paper. He shook it open. "Got a wire down in Helena a few weeks back." Cobb said, his eyes flicking to Hattie, then back to Gilbert. "Seems the federal magistrate is taking a real keen interest in that respectable businessman who got his skull crushed. Turns out he had friends in the capital. They put a bounty on the girl who did it. $500 dead or alive." He held the poster up. The sketch was crude, but the description printed beneath it was damning. Large woman. Fair hair. Answers to Harriet. Now. Cobb continued, resting his hand on the butt of his Colt revolver. "I'm looking at a woman who fits that bill mighty fine. And I'm remembering a mountain man who lied to my face back in November. So here's how this goes, Gilbert. You step aside. We put irons on the beast and we ride back down. You play nice, and I might just forget to mention to the judge that you were harboring her." Gilbert looked at the 2 deputies. Their rifles were no longer resting casually. They were angled toward his chest. He looked back at Hattie. She wasn't shaking. The terror had passed, replaced by a grim, devastating resignation. She lowered the iron skillet. "Gilbert," she said, her voice eerily calm. "It's over." "Shut your mouth," Gilbert barked, not looking at her. He kept his eyes locked on Cobb. "She's smarter than you, mountain man." Cobb sneered, urging his horse a half-step forward. "Don't die over a fat, murderous whore. She ain't worth the lead." The word snapped something deep and fundamental inside Gilbert. It wasn't a heroic impulse. It was pure, violent possessiveness. "I told you in November. Amos." Gilbert said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "She's my wife. And I'm calling you a liar." Cobb spat, drawing his revolver with terrifying speed. Before the barrel could level, Gilbert moved. He didn't dive for cover. He lunged forward, grabbing the heavy, splitting maul resting against the chopping block. With a guttural roar, he swung it in a massive, sweeping arc. He didn't aim for Cobb. He aimed for the roan gelding's front knees. The heavy iron wedge struck bone with a sickening crack. The horse shrieked a terrible, high-pitched scream of agony and collapsed forward like a dropped stone. Cobb was thrown over the animal's neck, plunging face first into the dirt and rocky mud. His revolver fired wildly into the trees. The deputy on the left cursed and swung his rifle toward Gilbert. A deafening clang shattered the air. The deputy screamed, dropping his rifle, clutching his face. Hattie had hurled the cast-iron skillet with the force of a blacksmith swinging a hammer. It caught the man square in the jaw, shattering bone and knocking him backward out of his saddle. The 3rd deputy panicked. His horse reared, spooked by the screaming roan and the sudden violence. The man fired a shot blindly, the bullet tearing through the fleshy part of Gilbert's upper arm. Gilbert ignored the burning sting. He dropped the maul, drew his hunting knife in one fluid motion, and charged the rearing horse. He grabbed the animal's bridle, dragging his weight down, and drove the hilt of the knife hard into the deputy's kneecap. The man howled, his leg buckling in the stirrup. "Drop it!" Gilbert roared, pressing the blood-stained blade against the deputy's thigh, mere inches from his femoral artery. "Drop the damn gun, or I'll gut you right here." The deputy, pale and trembling, let his rifle slip from his fingers. It hit the dirt. Gilbert stepped back, his chest heaving, blood soaking the sleeve of his shirt. The clearing smelled of cordite horse sweat and fresh copper. Cobb was groaning in the dirt, his face a bloody mask of gravel and split skin. He spat out a tooth, struggling to push himself up. Gilbert walked over to him. He kicked Cobb's fallen revolver into the thick ferns. Then he reached down, grabbed the marshal by the lapels of his dusty coat, and hauled him to his knees. "Look at me, Amos." Gilbert hissed, his face inches from the lawman's. Cobb blinked, blood dripping from his nose. "You're a dead man, Callahan. You assaulted a federal officer. They'll send the cavalry." "Maybe," Gilbert said, "but you won't be leading them. You ride down this mountain, Amos. You tell whoever asks that you found Gilbert Callahan's cabin empty. If you ever come back up this trail, if I ever see your face in my sights again, I won't swing at the horse." "Understand." Cobb stared into Gilbert's dark, manic eyes. He saw no bluff there. He saw a man who had entirely abandoned society. The marshal swallowed hard, a slow, jerky nod escaping his bruised neck. Gilbert shoved him backward into the dirt. "Take your men," Gilbert ordered the remaining mounted deputy. "Put Amos on your horse. Leave the crippled one. Go." It took them 10 agonizing minutes to load the unconscious deputy and the bleeding marshal onto the 2 remaining horses. Gilbert didn't offer to put Cobb's horse out of its misery until they were out of sight. When the clearing was finally empty, save for the thrashing, dying animal, Gilbert picked up the discarded revolver. He walked over to the horse, placed the barrel behind its ear, and pulled the trigger. The crack echoed through the pines, followed by a heavy, final silence. Gilbert dropped the gun. His left arm was on fire, the fabric of his shirt clinging wetly to his bicep. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving him hollow and shaking. He turned around. Hattie was standing on the porch. She hadn't moved. She was staring at the dead horse, her chest rising and falling in sharp, jagged gasps. She looked at Gilbert's bleeding arm, then up to his face. "You shot a marshal," she whispered. "You crippled his men. You broke the law. I broke it the day I let you inside," Gilbert said, his voice exhausted. He walked heavily toward the porch, clutching his wounded arm. He climbed the steps, his boots leaving bloody, muddy tracks on the wood. He stopped in front of her. "Pack your things." Hattie's eyes widened. "What?" "Pack the flour, the salt, whatever dried meat is left." Gilbert commanded, his tone entirely practical, now devoid of anger. "Grab the heavy coats. Leave the plates. You're throwing me out?" she asked, her voice cracking, the old rejection flaring to life. "After I just—" "I'm not throwing you out, Hattie." Gilbert sighed, leaning his good shoulder against the doorframe. He closed his eyes against a wave of dizziness. "We can't stay here. Cobb will go to Helena. He'll lie. He'll say I ambushed him. He'll bring 20 men with repeating rifles in a week. They'll burn this cabin to the ash and hang us both from the same pine branch." Hattie stared at him, the reality of the situation slowly crashing down over her. The sanctuary was gone. The lie had become a violent truth. "Where will we go?" she asked. "West," Gilbert said, opening his eyes. He looked out at the jagged peaks of the Bitterroots, the only home he had known for a decade. Over the pass, Idaho Territory, maybe Oregon, Out where warrants from Helena don't mean spit, Gilbert Hattie said softly, reaching out. Her thick, warm fingers gently touched his uninjured shoulder. You're giving up your claim, your traps, everything you built. Because of me. Gilbert looked at her hand. It was stained with mud and rust from the skillet. It was the hand of a survivor. He looked up at her face, seeing the deep, rugged lines of character, the undeniable strength that had hauled him back from the edge of death in the dead of winter. I built a shack in the dirt, Hattie, he said quietly. It ain't worth dying for. He reached up with his uninjured arm and grabbed her hand, squeezing it tight. When we get to Idaho, Gilbert said, his dark eyes locking onto hers, intense and entirely serious, we find a magistrate, a blind one if we have to, and we make the lie real. Hattie's breath hitched. She stared at him, searching his scarred, grim face for pity or mockery. She found neither. She found only the raw, stubborn reality of a man who had made his choice. You want to marry me? She whispered, her voice trembling. For real? I already claimed you. Gilbert said, a faint, bitter smile touching the corner of his mouth. 3 times now. Seems like a waste of breath not to put it on paper. He let go of her hand and pushed off the doorframe, wincing as his wounded arm throbbed. Now bind this arm before I bleed to death on my own porch. We have 2 mules to pack and a mountain to cross before sundown. Hattie watched him walk into the dim interior of the cabin. A tear, hot and fast, slipped down her cheek, cutting a clean line through the dust. It wasn't a tear of sorrow or fear. It was the crushing, overwhelming weight of finally, after a lifetime of running, being seen, being kept. She wiped the tear away roughly with the back of her hand, squared her broad shoulders, and followed her husband inside. Wow. Talk about a brutal, beautiful ending. If Gilbert and Hattie's raw, unpolished journey into the West kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who appreciates a grounded, gritty romance where survival means everything. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next deep dive Western drama. Do you think they made it to Oregon? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and see you on the next trail.